Okay, so I just wanted to address the reliance that people have on scores like this from GTMetrix, or this score here of 98, 99, PageSpeed Insights. We've got a 72 on a mobile and a 99 on a desktop. Now, what if I was to tell you that all of these are testing the same page? So we run a test on my homepage. When I run GTMetrix out of San Francisco, I get a performance of 83 and an LCP of 1.9 seconds. When I run it out of Australia, I get a performance of 98 and LCP of 0.67 or 671 milliseconds. PageSpeed Insights tells me that my mobile performance is poor. Well, not really poor. That's not terrible, but people seem to be aiming for this being up around the 98, 99, 100 on mobile. And it is achievable, but is it even worth worrying about? Now, the problem I have with this is a couple of things which I'll demonstrate, is that when you're hosting through somewhere in the world, like where I am in Australia, which has a relatively high latency to the US, all of that latency is counted against this, whatever the score number that they give you. So if I was to move this site to US hosted without doing anything else, I would get probably up around 99, 100%, as I do from desktop on here. The fact is that my clients are in Australia, their clients are in Australia. If they have clients overseas, I would typically use a CDN or content delivery network to speed up the access to the assets. But within Australia, if I use a CDN, it actually negatively impacts the performance of the website. So it's only a small amount, but it's enough to consider. So now the hosting I'm using out of Sydney here in Australia, I think is extremely good. And by adding the CDN to it, it actually adds a little bit of latency to the access of the assets. So it's not something that I'm going to do for clients within Australia, unless they have an overseas reach, where we'll suffer that small amount of performance loss in Australia to increase our performance globally, if that makes sense. So really it depends on the situation. Where are the clients going to be accessing this site from? Now, looking at the actual page, and I'll come back to some of these reports. So this is the actual page. And I'll firstly look at my speed of my internet at the moment. So at the moment, my internet speed's telling me I'm getting 62.9 megabits a second down. Let's test this again. Now, I'm on a NBN plan on 100 megabits per second. Now, the reality is that it varies all of the time. It is not a dedicated 100 meg service. So as you see on this test, I got 53. Sometimes when I test, I get as low as 25. Sometimes I test and I'm getting up to 100. So it varies all of the time. So the speed that you're going to load your pages at is clearly going to vary because of that. So what you need to do is do multiple tests and take the average of what you get, or check your internet speed first and then have a look at it. So if we go to my actual homepage, and there's one other thing I'm going to look at here is another metric. So I've installed a Core Web Vitals plugin. So I'm going to just do a Control F5 to reload this page and then have a look at my Web Vitals here. Now that said, it took 1 second for the LCP and a CLS of 0.008. If I do a Control F5 again, and I look at that, 0.6 seconds. Do it again, 0.7 seconds. Now, the hosting I've got is definitely not overloaded. It's got a 10 meg internet connection. It's a dedicated server. There's not a lot of variation out of that. The variation I'm seeing that is because of this varying. It's not a constant. It's always varying. And this just gives you an average when you run the test. So that's to be expected. But I'm seeing every time I do a Control F5 here, what my browser is going to be reporting back to Google is well within what Google considers to be good. So 0.5 seconds. Now let's have a look at Chrome Devtools. So I'm going to bring up my F12 for Chrome Devtools, and I'm just going to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see a bit better. So I bring up my network tools, disable the cache, and I want to see all activity. Do a Control F5 here. So this time I've got just under 1 second. Control F5 again, 0.8 seconds. Control F5 again, 0.8. Control F5 again, 0.9. Now this varies all the time. Like when I was preparing for this video, this was down around 0.4 seconds. At the moment, it's up around 0.8 seconds, which is still pretty good. But that's my internet variability, not the website. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, as a test, I'm going to switch my internet connection. I've got my mobile phone here. I'm going to switch over to that. It looks like my mobile phone just timed out. I'm just going to quickly enable that. Nope, there it is. So I'm going to click to my mobile phone. Now this is a typical sort of I'm on a 4G network in Australia, and this is a typical sort of internet connection speed that I'm going to get in Australia. Again, it varies a lot. So I'm going to test my page speed on my mobile. So you can see it jumping all over the place, and I'm kind of averaging at the moment somewhere around 30 to 40 meg. When I run my tests for the actual speed I expect, I look at somewhere around 15 down, because most mobiles in Australia will not get less than 15 megabits a second down. Occasionally they might drop in some poor coverage areas, but they're not really going to get less than 15. Now, at the moment, I'm averaging 48 down. There's days where that's around 12, and there's days where it's up around 100. So again, the mobile networks vary, but typically not less than 15 meg in Australia. So I'm going to see what my page speed looks like on that. So I'm looking at 1.15 seconds, 1.09, 1.17. Still pretty good on a mobile, right? So what at 1.65? So on 1.65, let's have a look at metrics here. Still saying my LCP is 1.4 seconds, CLS 0.15. I'll do it again. 1.4 seconds LCP. 0.8 seconds LCP. So it's going to vary again, but that's pretty good. So Google pretty much looks at anything under 2 seconds as being acceptable. Over 2 seconds, it's questionable, and I'm not sure what that threshold is where it becomes a warning. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm in Gold Coast in Queensland. My hosting is in Sydney, so I'm not sitting right next door to this. This is actually a fair way away from me. And I'm confident that my customers in Australia are going to get this kind of speed when they access this site. I'm happy with that. I know that the browsers are going to be feeding back this kind of metrics to Google, which is what they will rank on, because the core web vitals is what they rank on. It's not going to be this metric here, because they don't rank that, and this test is run out of the US. So in Australia, we're penalised by the latency. So I'll show you what I mean by that. If I go into the San Francisco test I did here and go to my waterfall, every one of these has 730 milliseconds, 740, 759, so almost 800 milliseconds. So almost 0.8 second penalty I get on every single connection to an asset. Now, my site does have HTTP3, so a lot of these are done in parallel, so I don't get a cumulative shift on all these, but that does make a difference. So at least my page load is going to be penalised by at least 0.8 seconds, as opposed to if this was hosted in the US, or if I was using a CDN where these assets are served from the closest server, in this case be the US, that would be a lot better. But I would then find in Australia, let's have a look at my Australian one actually. If I go to Australia and look at my waterfall, I'm looking at, what do we got here? 2 millisecond blocking, 41 millisecond. Now that's actually not great. Typically when I look at this, I'm getting around 20 to 25 millisecond. So because of internet variability, when I ran this test, it has given me 51 milliseconds, which is still fine. What I find in Australia, this may be different in other countries, when I put this through a CDN, I've tried Rabbit, I've tried Cloudflare, I've tried Rocket, I've tried Bunny, and all of them this latency is higher than it is directly from my server. So I'm typically seeing a latency of double that. So around about 100 milliseconds. So not huge, but it does add some delay to my site, which will get reported as caught Web Vitals. And we want the best we possibly can reported to Google. So in my case, not using a CDN is actually better for me. So once again, if these clients were in the US or any other part of the world and we're hosting in Australia, I would definitely put it through a CDN so that we can reduce the TDFB on all of these. So that's pretty much my thinking for that. PageSpeed Insights, again, this is an emulator run out of the US, so I don't give that any credence at all. I do look at this to go, well, okay, if that was really low, if that's somewhere down around 20 or 30, I'll be looking at why is that and looking for some clues in what is it that I need to fix up. But if I run this out of Australia and I get this sort of result, then why do I even care? Because that's what's reported to Google. I know I'm waffling. There's a lot to try and juggle in my head and think about as we go through this. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing. I'm just going to switch back to my NBN connection. So I'm off my mobile again. And I'll just do a quick Control F5 here. And that wasn't great. Let's do it again. 1.8 seconds. I would say that if I did a speed test here, this is going to be terrible. It's actually looking okay, but that is definitely variability on the internet that's causing that. 1.28. So the beginning of this, remember I was on my NBN connection and I was getting around 0.8. Now it's 0.3 seconds more than that. I might, for the purpose of this, switch back to my mobile connection. So there's a 4G connection. And do it again. So down to 1.3, 1.5, 1.3, 1.7, 1.2. So again, it's still a little bit higher than it was to start with, but it's still pretty good. And this is the whole point. It's really depending on a lot of factors. And when you're running this test, it's really dependent on your local internet connection speed. Now, I'll show you one other thing that I generally do here is in Chrome Devtools at the moment when you're in your network your network tab, by default, it's set to no throttling. So you get your full internet speed. I add a custom one, so you can add custom ones here, of 15 megabits per second by 10 up, which is probably the lowest I would expect from an Australian mobile. Now let's have a quick look at that. And if I go to my throttling here, so I'm going to delete those numbers. So you can see here, so when you set up your throttling in the Chrome Devtools here, you enter it in kilobits per second. Now my mobile speeds, I'm talking about megabits per second. So 15 megabits per second times 3, with 3 zeros, sorry, to make it kilobits per second. So 10, then 1, 2, 3. So that's 15 megabits per second by 10 megabits per second. So I'm going to save that. And then we'll go back to here. And I'm going to select my throttling. And then do a Control F5. That's 1.3. 1.15. So you can see in this case here, it's not making much of a difference. Now, big part of that is if you look at the megabytes transferred, it's only 1.3 megabytes. So the speed is not going to affect it that much because it's such a small amount of data that it's got to download. If I went to their slow 3G, for example, I'm not sure even what the megabits per second are on that, and I do a Control F5, you can see it's going to take a lot longer. And this might be less than a megabit per second, I would say. Look at that, 10, 12. How slowly it's transferring that. This is just unrealistic. Even on slow 3G connections, I'm seeing better speeds than that in the past. So I don't know where they get these numbers from. But let's look at a fast 3G. A fast 3G, Here we go. We're still counting. That took 8 seconds. Now, the reality is that it is downloaded 1 megabyte in 8 seconds. So I'm not sure where they're getting their throttling numbers from here, but I've never seen a 3G connection that's less than 1 megabit per second. Actually, I guess that would work out because you got to multiply by 8 bits, so 1 times 8, so that's 8. That's about right, actually. So I'd say that's actually limiting to 1 megabit per second. So 1 megabyte times 8 is 8 megabits. So that's taken 8 seconds, which is actually pretty accurate. So fast 3G, they're saying is 1 megabyte per second, or 1 megabit per second, which I don't think is correct. I think fast 3G is more like 3 megabytes or megabits per second, but we don't have 3G here in Australia anymore, so I'm not concerned about that at all. All I care about is the no throttling speed, 1.2 there, and my throttling at 15 by 10. And with both of those, I know that on a mobile, this is what's going to be reported to Google, roughly for my LCP and my CLS. On a desktop with a decent internet connection, I know that roughly this is what's going to be reported to Google, and that's fantastic. So as far as I'm concerned, PageSpeed Insights says my mobile is only 72%. My Core Web Vitals here tell me that everything's great. I'm going to trust what I see in my browser, not what I see from some emulator run out of the US. That's not even factored as ranking factors. So for all of you guys out there that jump onto the forums and set up your optimization and your hosting out of something like SiteGround, something like out of the US or UK or whatever, and you throw up your performance chart that shows 99 or 100% here, really, so what? What is that really telling you? This is what is important. This is what your users see. This is what you should be looking at, as far as I'm concerned. Now, again, my strong opinions, but they're just my opinions. There's plenty of people out there that are going to disagree with me, but that's pretty much how I do things here. My sites work really, really quickly here in Australia. My customers are really happy with the speeds I get. They get good reports through Google, not so good reports necessarily through PSI or tools like Ahrefs or SEMrush, which do all of their testing overseas. Case in point, if I use Ahrefs, it pretty much says every one of my pages is slow unless I do CDNs, because all the testing for Ahrefs is done out of India, so I immediately get penalized for almost 1 second for every single asset query that page does. So I cannot trust those reports. I trust what I see in my browser. I trust what I see on my mobile, and that's pretty much where I stick to.